Okay, we might as well get started then. Welcome to the International Institute for Strategic Studies. My name's Dana Allen. I'm a senior fellow and editor of our journal Survival here at the IISS. Our speaker today really, to almost all of you, I think, needs no introduction, not least because he has really been anchoring one of our core areas of nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation with, a special, I would say, even relentless focus on the Iranian nuclear issue. But I will say a couple words about him. He's been here for 9 years, he's in his 9th year in any event at the IISS as Director of Disarmament, Director of Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, the program thereabout. He came here in 2005 after 26 years at the U.S. Department of State, where he spent a lot of time in East Asia and also working on nuclear proliferation issues, ending as Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Non-Proliferation. He's the author of a large number of very important IISS publications, including the Iranian nuclear crisis, avoiding worst-case outcomes, a number of our series of IISS strategic dossiers, and a long list of survival articles. He's contributing editor also of my journal. And his subject today is assessing the current interim agreement on Iran's nuclear program.
Thank you, Dana. I'm optimistic about the Iran nuclear deal for the short term. I'm pessimistic for the long term. I think there's no more than a 10% possibility that the parties will be able to negotiate a comprehensive agreement. I think there's about an 80% chance that the current interim deal will get rolled over for another 6 months. That leaves 10% possibility of diplomacy breaking down. I'm positive about the interim deal because under the joint plan of action, Iran's capabilities have been capped. The time to produce 1 weapon's worth of highly enriched uranium will double approximately under this deal. And without the deal, that time would have been cut in half by next summer. Significant compromises were made by each side. The 6 powers had asked for 3 things: stop, ship, and shut. Stop the 20% enrichment, ship out the accumulated stockpile, and shut down Fordo. Stop, ship, and shut. They got one of those, stop. And they only got a pale equivalent of ship because the accumulated stockpile will disappear, but it won't be sent out of the country. It'll be converted into other forms that can be reconverted. The 6 parties agreed to a maintenance of Iran's enrichment program. This more or less makes the Security Council resolution calls for suspension overtaken by events. And I think that was Iran's biggest achievement in this diplomacy, to get the recognition that they will be continuing uranium enrichment. Now, there was no explicit right to enrichment in the deal. No words that said right to enrichment. And that, I think, was Iran's biggest concession. They had been talking beforehand that if that right was not explicitly guaranteed, there would be no deal. But they were willing to strike a deal without those words. And it was a classic diplomatic fudge. Each side interpreted the deal differently. Iran said, yes, they got the right. The West said, no, it wasn't in the deal. The threat of war has been put off by this deal. Military options remain on the table in case that 10% possibility of a breakdown, because Obama still is determined that Iran will not acquire a nuclear weapon. Hassan Rouhani delivered on his promise to the Iranian people to start dialing back the sanctions, but not by too much. The $4.2 billion of frozen assets that Iran will get over the next 6 months, and I got the first tranche of that on Saturday, represents only 4% of their frozen assets. And these are their assets. Nobody's paying them any money that's not already theirs, just releasing some of it that's frozen. There's another $3 billion or so of worth of other sanctions relief. It's a little bit hard to calculate that. Because even for things that are now allowed, banks are reluctant to offer letters of credit to Iran. And the bank that has been most useful in being the transactional intermediary, Halk Bank in Turkey, got itself into deep, deep trouble for that. So they're mired in scandal, and I don't think we'll be doing that anymore. But the mood in Iran is optimistic. They see more and more sanctions relief on the horizon, and combined with a reduction in inflation and a rise in the value of the rial, things are looking rosier in Iran. Critics fear that the sanctions program will now unravel more. I think that's wrong for two reasons. It's wrong because, first of all, without this deal, I think sanctions would have unraveled in and of themselves. You know, the biggest sanction is United States putting pressure on the 6 countries that still import Iranian oil to keep continuously reducing those imports. In the last 6 months of 2013, China, the biggest importer, reduced by only 2%. I think China was nearing the point where they weren't going to dial it back anymore anyway. The other reason I think it's wrong to say that the sanctions regime is going to unravel is because the United States, the United Kingdom in particular, are intent to keep the existing sanctions applicable. So the United States Treasury in December reached a $100 million deal, a settlement with the Bank of Scotland for its violations of the existing sanctions. Last month, the United States Treasury reached a $158 million deal with Clearstream Banking based in Luxembourg for their violations of U.S. law regarding handling transactions for Iran. I'm positive about the interim deal because I think neither side has any incentive to cheat and to lose the benefits that they get under the deal. The momentum in the U.S. Congress to push for new sanctions, which would, I think, scuttle diplomacy, at least for some period of time, has shifted. The momentum has shifted. You know, it was extraordinary that 59 senators, including 16 Democrats, had signed up for applying new sanctions on Iran, sanctions that would have moved the goalposts, would have set impossible demands for Iran, would have registered support for military action. It's just incredible that that many senators signed up for something. I don't think they all read the small print. What they read was this was an anti-Iran measure. The pro-Israel lobbyists wanted it, and that was probably enough for many of the senators. They said they were helping Obama by playing bad cop. That's not the way he saw it. He thought that if you've just struck a deal with Iran under which you're going to cap the sanctions, and then having new sanctions apply would naturally cause the Iranians to walk away from diplomacy, just as the West would walk away from diplomacy if Iran had done something similar, like the Iranian parliament was talking about doing, insisting that uranium enrichment had to be ramped up to 60%, supposedly as fuel for non-existent submarines, but just obviously a way that the Iranian parliament wanted to have a mere kind of action to that which the senators were talking about. A White House spokesman called that new sanctions bill a vote for war. And that's actually the way many analysts in the United States saw it. Major newspapers, major commentators, almost every single expert on Iran, not just in the United States, I think anywhere in the world, realized that this was a bad idea. And once the implementation arrangements for the interim deal were agreed on the 13th of January, it took the wind out of the sails of that new bill. And the number of senators supporting it not only was capped at 59, it started to get rolled back. By now, 5 senators have expressed the intention that that bill not be brought to a vote in the Senate, and Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid has no intention to bring it to a vote. I'm pessimistic about the long term. As I said, I think it's a very small possibility of striking a deal. It's because the two sides are so far apart in their demands for what the comprehensive deal should entail. The West want deep cutbacks, the elimination of the vast majority of Iran's centrifuges, an end to the Fordow facility, an end to the Iraq heavy water-moderated research reactor. And they want the period of limitations at the end of the deal, the end game, to last for a generation. I don't mean a generation of centrifuges, I mean a human generation, 20 to 25 years for that those limits to be in place. And they want clarity on those apparently weapons-related nuclear activities in which Iran was engaged previously, that the IEA has been seeking to get answers to. Iran, for its part, doesn't want to dismantle anything, as President Rouhani told Fareed Zakaria a week ago. Iran wants to keep the capability to be able to produce nuclear weapons if a political decision is made to do so. It's willing to make tactical adjustments, but it sees those tactical limits lasting not a generation, certainly, at most a couple of years. Nor is Iran willing to fess up to any of the weaponization work that it apparently was engaged in up until 2004 and some after that. And in exchange for the limits that they are willing to accept, they want all sanctions lifted, not suspended, but sanctions lifted. Zakaria saw this insistence on not dismantling anything as a looming train wreck. Now, some of this, there was quite a lot of brouhaha in the press a week ago about this dismantlement issue, and some of it was semantic and confused. Iran insisted that the interim deal did not call for any dismantlement. The White House had used the word dismantlement in describing some of the steps that Iran was taking under the deal. And Iran was right about that. The word dismantlement doesn't appear in the deal. But it's kind of like the right to enrichment doesn't appear in the deal either. It's how you interpret things. Iran, under the deal, removed the tubing between cascades. Well, that's a dismantlement in one form. The real issue is what's going to happen in the longer stage. Will there have to be dismantlement? It's become, I'm afraid it's becoming a kind of an ideological edge issue. I remember in the North Korean case, the insistent demand of the United States and its partners was that North Korea dismantle comprehensive, verifiable, and irreversible dismantlement. CVID was the rallying cry, and we never got it. Now, that doesn't mean it wasn't the wrong, it was the wrong thing to ask for. It was the right thing, but dismantlement isn't always possible. In the Iran case, since they're going to be having some enrichment, that's acknowledged, CVID obviously isn't applicable. It won't be complete. So I think that rather than insisting on dismantlement as a kind of principle, that the West, the six powers, that is, should determine what they could accept in terms of the breakout time for Iran to be able to produce enough fissile material for a nuclear weapon. That breakout time, which some analysts have calculated before the deal, was 1.5 months. If Iran made a decision to rush for it, they get enough for a weapon's worth of HEU, highly enriched uranium. That is going to be 3 months in summer. How many months do you need? I think it's got to be between 6 and 12. It can't be less than 6 months. It has to, even though the IAEA would be able to detect breakout within a week if it were to happen at Fordow or Natanz, because they're inspecting with that frequency, for the powers to get their act together enough to take the action to stop breakout, they don't do that quickly. There's a lot of diplomacy that goes on. We see what happens in Syria. 6 months seems to me a reasonable aiming point as a minimum, and some would say, no, it has to be 12 months. So then you take how long you're willing to accept for the breakout period, and then you can work backwards. How many centrifuges and at what efficiency, as measured in separative work units, to what extent Fordo needs to be mothballed, how much research and development is permissible and where, and whether centrifuges need to be dismantled or whether they can be disabled or otherwise put out of commission. And I think about the North Korean case a lot. In the case of the 1994 U.S.-North Korea agreed framework, the reactors under construction just were allowed to rust out. They weren't dismantled, but after a few years they became unusable. I'm not saying that centrifuges will be allowed to rust out, but that wouldn't be a bad way of handling them out in the rain. Anyway, there are technical solutions to most of the problems that I think will impede the final settlement. The excess centrifuges could be sent to a third country for safekeeping. Fordo could be used for something else besides uranium enrichment. Iraq would have to be shut down. It could be upgraded to a light water reactor. If you're talking about upgrading, it's a face-saving way of changing something so it's not proliferation, so that it is proliferation resistant. The time frame for how long these limits should last, I think, could be put to an international neutral body, the International Atomic Energy Agency. And they have a way to do this. Under the agreed framework, if a country is sincerely implementing the agreed framework, the IAEA can draw conclusions about the absence of undeclared nuclear activity. And for the case of a country that doesn't have any problems, it could take a couple of years. I think it took Canada, Japan, 2-3 years for that conclusion to be drawn. In the case of Iran, with all the problems it's had, obviously that period of time is going to be longer than a couple of years. And the IAEA won't be able to draw that conclusion for Iran as long as they have information about anomalies or activity that needs to be investigated. And I'm pretty sure that there will be countries that will continually be feeding them information about anomalies that would keep this period of time stretched out. Maybe not to 20 years, but until there's strong satisfaction that they have no activities of a potential military nature. Other problems, the problem about Iran insisting that sanctions be lifted. The U.S. Congress doesn't lift sanctions. In the case of the sanction against the Soviet Union for not freely allowing the emigration of Soviet Jews, the Jackson-Vanik Amendment penalized the Soviet Union and then the successor state Russia for 20 years after Soviet Jews were allowed to freely emigrate. And then it finally got lifted, but only in exchange for something else onerous put on Russia, the Magnitsky bill. So Congress, they could lift sanctions, but they're just not inclined to do it. So suspending sanctions is what Iran is going to have to accept. The president has the authority to suspend many of the sanctions. He has the authority to not implement them fully or fastly. There are things that he can do. Iran will have to accept that. Now, so as I say, I think there are solutions, there are technical diplomatic solutions to many of the hard issues, but whether these solutions will be acceptable in the key capitals of Washington and Tehran, I just doubt it. So I think rollover of the deal is most likely for another 6 months. Now, and rollover with some incremental additional elements, some more sanctions lifted, some more limits on Iran's program. Whether it can continue to be rolled over for more than just one time, I don't know. This coming November, the election in the United States, midterm elections in which the Republicans, I think, have a structural advantage. This could make rollover more difficult. Although I suppose if it comes to the end of the time and the countries are faced with, do we roll it over or do we accept a return to more centrifuges, more sanctions, they might at that point decide that rollover is the best option. Some might ask, well, doesn't rollover just play to Iran's benefit? Isn't this what Iran just wants? I don't buy the argument that negotiations are a way for Iran to buy time so that it can continue its nuclear program, because they've been continuing the nuclear program anyway, with or without negotiations. And under the interim deal, the advances are being capped, so they're not able to proceed as much as they would without the deal. And I think Iran has a potential domestic issue. They've raised expectations about more sanctions being lifted, and they could face trouble internally if they can't meet these expectations. So I think they are not just playing for time. They really do want more sanctions lifted. The status quo on sanctions could be potentially dangerous for them. One of the things I do worry about in the interim deal is the research and development. It's one area where Iran can continue to make advances. The Joint Plan of Action specifies that Iran will continue its safeguarded R&D practices, including its current enrichment R&D practices. Questions arose in the last couple of months whether this meant that Iran could install new centrifuges as part of R&D work, or whether they could enrich above 5%, just for R&D purposes. And it was agreed, no, they have to just continue doing what they already were doing as reported by the IAEA. What that means, though, is that Iran currently has second, third, fourth, sixth generation centrifuges spinning at the pilot plant at Natanz. They will continue to spin. Iran will continue to then make progress in centrifuge efficiency. And that progress can be applied to any work that Iran might have going on, if they have any going on in secret clandestine plants. Now, the Joint Plan of Action says no new locations for enrichment. So there's not supposed to be any secret plants. But Iran's policy has been that it doesn't report new enrichment plants, no nuclear plants of any kind. It doesn't report them until 6 months until they're operational. And in 2009, Iran announced that they were building 10 new enrichment facilities. So it stands to reason that in the past 4 years, Iran probably has begun some new enrichment plants that they haven't revealed, secret plants. Now, how far along they are, who knows, maybe not so far, but under the terms of the deal, they're not supposed to have any new enrichment plants. If they had some already under construction, would they be new? Would Iran reveal them? Would they stop working on them? I think these are things to keep in mind as potential problem areas. There are other potential problem areas. In addition to Iran pushing the envelope on R&D and new centrifuges, or if evidence surfaces about new enrichment facilities discovered. If rumors about nuclear cooperation with North Korea are confirmed, I think that could create a mood in the U.S. Congress to call a halt to diplomacy. Or if the Majlis, if the Iranian parliament were to go ahead with something like their bill to insist that enrichment be raised to 60%, that would create a backlash. If Russia and Iran went through with their reported deal of a goods for oil swap, under which Russia would market Iranian oil as Russian oil, that would be seen as breaking the sanctions, and I think that would cause the U.S. Congress to call a halt to the deal. There could be external situations that could create difficulties. In Syria, where the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, Quds Force, is now engaged in supporting the Assad forces, and where there was a press report last week of the several of the funerals for the Quds Force, so-called volunteers. If that level of activity were to expand, that could create problems. If Iran's level of activity in support of the rebels in Yemen were to increase, if Iran were found to be supporting opposition activity in Bahrain, just in December, a speedboat carrying C4 explosives and ammunition was intercepted by the Bahraini police or the authorities. And according to the Ministry of Interior, the two Bahrainis on the boat said that they had come from Iran. They were trained in Iran, and they were coming to let off these explosives in Bahrain. Now, there's some reason to doubt the veracity of such statements. It's just kind of the example of something that I think could possibly make the deal go wrong. Let me end with this suggestion. If the interim deal is rolled over for another 6 months, it's got to be, I think, a better deal. And I think it should address the R&D, which I think is the biggest problem with the current deal. And I'm sure the six powers are already working on what other limits should be in place to restrict research and development. And in exchange, of course, they'll have to give something, some other suspension of some sanctions. And I think the one that might be equivalent might be, for example, the sanction on technology for oil and gas exploration or development. It's a kind of a similar in the technological area. And I think that kind of a deal might might counter the narrative that you hear often from Iran that all the West wants to do is to restrict their technological development. No, all the West wants to do is just to restrict their nuclear weapons development. Thank you.
Mark, thank you very much. I'm going to open the floor in just a moment. Let me ask you a first question, though. I mean, you laid out what you thought was, I assume, the best practical or the way, a framework for thinking about what might be achievable, which is a 6 to 12 month breakout period window. But I don't think you take it seriously as something that can actually be negotiated. And is that because, or maybe I'm wrong about that, but if I'm right about that, if I'm wrong about that, tell me. If I'm right about that, is it because, they're just political constellation cannot allow that degree of, on the Western side, and particularly the American side, can't allow that degree of sort of virtual nuclear status, nuclear weapons status? Or is it because it's going to break down because of a view of many experts, which is that Iran really does want nuclear weapons and is going to always push the envelope?
I think it could be negotiated. And I think there has been an important development with this interim deal is that there's been a recognition that Iran will have a continuing enrichment program. The demand for no enrichment at all is something you still hear, but it's restricted to a minority of voices in Israel and one half of the American political spectrum. I don't think you hear that too much in this country or in other places in Europe, but maybe a little bit in France. So if you're going to accept some degree of enrichment, then the obvious question is how much? And 6 to 12 months is not something I plucked out of the air. It's a time frame that has been discussed among serious people in Washington. David Albright, who runs the ISIS, often confused with our institute, recently published a report suggesting this. And then he said to get to 6 to 12 months, he said to get to 6 months, you would have to reduce the number of centrifuges to 4,000. And he explained, and you can, the calculations make sense. And 4,000 centrifuges, interestingly, is what an Iranian professor suggested at a conference in Brussels on October 1st, the EU Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Conference. He thought that 4,000 would be politically viable in Iran. What makes me think, though, Dana, that it's not politically viable is that Nasser Hadian, who said this in Brussels, also said that Fordo could not be touched, Iraq could not be touched, and then, of course, sanctions would have to be lifted. So there's so many conditions that would need to apply to reach the deal. That's why I think it's only got a 10% possibility.
Good, thank you. Jonathan Marcus, and please identify yourself as you step up, even if I do already.
Yeah, thank you very much. Jonathan Marcus, BBC. It's a fascinating and incisive talk as ever. Two questions. One, you talk about the diminishing momentum behind additional sanctions being voted in the States. Of course, one of the crucial things throughout this whole episode has been the willingness day to day to actually implement sanctions. So do you think that we're going to see a more relaxed approach by the Americans particularly over the coming months, or is there potential for set twos with the Iranians there? And could you say, secondly, a little bit about the extent to which the interim deal has provided much greater access to particular kinds of Iranian facilities for inspectors and so on, and the significance of all of that? I mean, is our level of knowledge of Iran's program going to have been significantly enhanced by the end of the 6-month period?
Thank you, Jonathan. I think the U.S. Treasury has gone out of its way to demonstrate that they are indeed willing and eager to enforce the existing sanctions. In addition to the two very large settlements that I mentioned for banks that had transgressed, you recall that in November, the U.S. designated 14 new entities, individuals and companies, front companies, to apply the blacklist to. This caused many in Iran to cry foul and to say that it was a violation of the spirit or the letter of the deal. But it wasn't, because those were existing sanctions. And as Iran turns to new front companies, I'm pretty sure the U.S. Treasury will continue to designate them. The extent to which greater access, certainly under the interim deal, the IEA has access to places they haven't been in almost 10 years. The centrifuge production and processing laboratories, they have access to Iraq on a more regular basis that they haven't had for a while. But I do note that they did have this kind of access back 10 years ago. I got a question from a journalist over the weekend about whether the White House might have been, this was from a fact checker in the Washington Post, whether the White House maybe had exaggerated in saying that there was unprecedented inspections under the deal. And I said, well, yes, it's unprecedented by virtue of the time element. The frequency of the access is more, so that's unprecedented. But actual places, I'm not sure that there's more than were the case 10 years ago.
In the second to the back row, there was a gentleman, yes.
Chris Jackson, I'm an associate with the Institute. I just wanted to ask, I guess, a question about the role of financial institutions in regards to sanction relief. I mean, you touched on how the United States has been taking still a very aggressive line with this, but you also spoke about how you believe there'd be one more rollover extension period, and then potentially, if another deal couldn't be reached, but both parties couldn't find an alternative mechanism, it could potentially be rolled on further. Tied with this in your point about potential domestic expectations within Iran to see more benefits from the Iranian sanction reduction, my question would be, would financial institutions feel comfortable enough stepping into this gap to actually provide the mechanisms necessary to start seeing the impacts of that sanction relief on the basis that these were conditional 6-month rollovers? And as you mentioned, there are so many caveats to whether or not these will carry out that period. If they don't feel comfortable to step in, what then happens? How do the sanctions then move forward? And would the US government take steps to try and reassure them to step in? Or would that just be a stumbling block that would have to hold until a later date?
Well, the U.S. government has already been trying to reassure banks that transactions involving the humanitarian goods that are specified in the deal will not be in any way penalized. The humanitarian goods means food, medicines, and related medical equipment, and bursaries for Iranian students studying overseas. Whether there will be banks that go ahead and do it is entirely a commercial decision, a political risk decision on the part of banks, and I think so far they've been cautious about that. Now, the United States is supposed to designate a channel for these humanitarian transactions. I don't know if that channel has been designated yet. I asked one of the European states whether the Europeans will be similarly designating a channel, and I was told the person I talked to didn't know if there were any such, but he reminded me that there were a lot of areas of commercial activity which were not sanctioned and which banks had every right to undertake. But again, it's just a matter of whether they do or not. It's too early for me to be able to judge how this will unravel. You know, we might see, I suppose we will see some momentum that some banks will begin to do it and they won't get penalized and then more will. But if they're only going to do in it for 6 to 12 months, you know, they might think, well, is it really worth it jeopardizing their reputation for that short period of time? Probably they'll wait.
Edwina Morton, right here.
Thank you. Edwina Morton, formerly an economist journalist covering this, as Mark knows all too well. Two questions that really relate to the past military activities and their consequences. Is there anything in this interim agreement or the mechanisms that are beginning to be formed as a result of it that will help or possibly hinder the IAEA in getting to the bottom of the questions which are still outstanding, which Iran has so far refused to answer? And the second part is, you say it would be good to extend the period of breakout to 6 to 12 months because that anything shorter than that would make diplomacy very difficult in the event of a whistle being blown. Given the length of time it's taken to get diplomacy to the point where Iran feels under any pressure to discuss things, and given your experience of North Korea, where the diplomacy has been going on for even longer, why would 6 to 12 months be a reassuring period? Thank you.
Edwina, you put your finger on an important point that the interim deal does not do much to get to the bottom of those nuclear activities with a possible military dimension that the IAEA has been intent on uncovering. And there is a potential problem here that these two diplomatic tracks, the one with the 6 powers and the one with the IAEA, diverge. And they diverge in ways like the Korean case that you and I know well. In the Korean case, the agreed framework was struck. The IAEA's role in continuing to safeguard activities was dispensed with. They were only involved in policing the agreed framework, and at some point in the future they were supposed to be able to unravel the past, and they never got to that point. And so that is a potential issue here. The IAEA is focused on, you know, past activity. The 6 powers are focused on future activity, and if they can get a deal on future activity, they might not be so meticulous about the other activities. But I don't want to cast aspersions on anything yet, but you've put your finger on an important issue. As for whether one should be feel confident that 6 to 12 months would be enough for major powers to take action in the event of a major transgression, I don't know. I mean, how much would one want? If 12 months aren't enough, why would 24 months be enough? It's absolutely a judgment call, and I'll leave it at that.
But I mean, you know, the implicit question I think is, I mean, we talk about major powers taking action. One of the underlying questions is whether the statement from the American president that we will not allow Iran to become a nuclear weapons state is one that would be taken seriously. And in the event of these transgressions, the United States would take military action. I mean, what is your view of, in other words, the breakout window is effective to the extent that it's filled with action, and what's your view about the likelihood of that?
I think there's one country that won't let that 6 to 12 months lapse without military action, and I think Israel has real capabilities. They absolutely would prefer not to do it alone, but if it comes to the point where the United States is not seen as being willing to take action, Israel has assets that it can deploy, and it can't do it as effectively. They can't knock out Fordo, but they can do a lot of damage at Natanz, and I think they are determined to do it.
And the U.S.?
I think Obama is serious about not allowing Iran to have a nuclear weapon, and it would depend his actions would depend on how clear it is that Iran is on the verge of getting a nuclear weapon. Now, the clarity might be very murky because of the nature of intelligence as it is, but if the intelligence analysts present the president with an assessment that Iran is weeks away from being able to produce a nuclear weapon, that might be enough to trigger it. He has taken resolute action. Not that the Osama bin Laden snatch was anything equivalent, but it was hotly debated and opposed by the vice president, among others, and he did it. So I don't think one could say he wouldn't do it in this case.
The gentleman in the back row, yes.
Desmond Bowen, I'm a member of the Institute. Mark, thanks very much for your talk. You talked about the West, and then occasionally corrected yourself to talk about, the six powers. And I just sort of wondered whether you could say something about the extent to which there is cohesion and harmony amongst the six, and whether that's likely to persist, and the extent to which Russian influence is actually having some effect on the Iranians, because the main players may be America and Iran, but actually this is very much an international undertaking.
Yeah, I did correct myself because in the negotiations it is six nations. Some members of the U.S. Senate think it's only one nation, and that's actually another answer to Edwina's question of why 6 to 12 months. And I think Russia and China would not go along with something over 12 months because of the low reductions that would, the limits that would put on Iran. So the 6 to 12, that time frame is not just an analytical time frame, it's a political time frame of what the traffic will bear with the six powers. And there's such an emphasis on maintaining unity among the six, without which the diplomacy doesn't work. It's a little bit hard for me to tell the degree of Russian influence so far on getting Iran to the negotiating table. I think it was much more the sanctions and much more the internal dynamics that produced a pragmatic president that brought Iran to where they are. And I don't see China having much role in this, but conceivably they could. I mean, they have played an important role in the sanctions implementation by agreeing to the United States arm twisting to reduce their purchases, but I think they've just about reached their limit on that.
Here in the front row, Baria.
Bari Alameddin, a member of the Institute and Al Hayat newspaper. Mark, I'm sorry, I didn't quite get what a deal breaker is. Did you mean something like what happened in Bahrain? And I did happen to be in Bahrain and interviewed the interior minister who showed me some, what they say, evidence. So would such events again be deal breakers? Is this what you meant? What are the deal breakers, if you can give us some main ones? And do you think that if there is, after 12 months, a war or a strike, let's put it this way, on Iran, would that really finish their nuclear program? Thank you.
Yes, Baria, I outlined just before you came in some of the potential deal breakers. And I noted that there were some that are about the nuclear program, there are some are just external. And when the U.S. Senate was talking about these new sanctions measures and they were wanting to change the goalpost, one way they did that was by focusing on issues outside of the nuclear realm. In the missile, if Iran were to develop more and test more missiles, or if groups associated with Iran were to engage in terrorism against the United States. That means that if Hezbollah were to attack a U.S. embassy or something, this would be a deal breaker in the minds of some U.S. senators. And depending on the size of that terrorist incident, you could have a large majority of U.S. senators reaching that conclusion. I mentioned the Bahrain gun running case as a small example of the kind of thing that one could think about. Your second question, I forgot.
So did I.
Yes, if waging a strike on
yeah,
Iran
yeah.
would actually eliminate its nuclear
No, I mean,
threat.
no, I think we've talked about that before in this room and elsewhere. Waging a military a strike on Iran would not eliminate the program because the knowledge is still there in people's heads, and I'm sure they have centrifuges, parts in places that won't be hit, and so they would be able to reconstitute the program. How quickly they would be able to reconstitute depends on how thorough was the bombing. If it was the United States, it would be delayed longer than if it was Israel.
Yes.
Scott Proudfoot from the Canadian High Commission. Two questions, if I may. The first one, perhaps more technical. The rationale Iran has offered for having a requirement for enrichment is that they need an assured supply. 10 years ago, at least, Iran's uranium mining was not economically viable. I wonder if that's changed any. A bigger question, Mark, and I realize nobody has the answer to this, but I ask you to speculate a bit. Has Rouhani made a strategic decision to forsake a nuclear weapons program? And to what degree, if he has, can he command consensus within Iran?
Okay, thanks, Scott. I forgot to mention one aspect of the interim deal, which is that it recognized a principle that Iran could have enrichment as is needed for its civilian programs. Now, under that principle, and it's something that Dana and I have often talked with Iranian academics about, under that principle, Iran doesn't need any enrichment because Russia supplies all the fuel for the Bushehr reactor, and they now have 20 years' worth of 20% enriched uranium for the Tehran research reactor. So, yeah, the enrichment could go very, very low indeed and still meet their civilian needs, but sometime in the future they might need, and so that's one reason to keep some enrichment going on. You you noted that the mining was not deemed economically viable. Actually, it's more than just not being economically viable. I mean, Iran's enrichment program is not economically viable. They're doing it for other reasons. The point about the mining is that Iran does not have enough natural uranium, enough uranium ore to meet the expansive plans it puts forward for having 20 nuclear power plants. The Kachin mine, which the IAEA fortunately is now inspecting, is only sufficient for, I want to say 1 or 2 power plants. I don't have that figure totally, but yeah. So Iran's projected enrichment, projected nuclear program isn't really viable unless they're reintegrated in the international community and can import uranium ore, and that won't happen until they get a clean bill of health. Has Rouhani made a strategic decision to forego a nuclear weapons program? No, I don't think so at all. What I said is that they've been willing to make tactical adjustments, but they still want to have the capability to produce nuclear weapons if there is a political decision to do so. And that if is important, because I don't think they've made such a political decision, but they want to be able to get there if the circumstances change, the fatwa is lifted.
Gordon Varus here in the front row.
Mark, at Davos, Rouhani spoke of Iran wanting to be one of the world's top 10 industrial powers or economic powers. What does that statement in that place tell you about his considerations in evaluating the various options?
I think, Gordon, that Rouhani's statement in Davos was very consistent with the two themes that we hear over and over. One theme is that Iran is not North Korea. They don't want to be isolated. They have a very entrepreneurial-minded, internationally cosmopolitan-minded population that wants to be integrated with the world. They want the sanctions lifted. They can't obviously reach that goal without that. the second theme, this is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but Iran does like to exaggerate. I don't see them being among the top 10 economic powers of the world. But, you know, they're a 70 million population, middle power, and they certainly, if they can get this yoke lifted from their necks, will be an important player in the world.
We have time for a couple more questions, but until somebody wants to ask one, Mark, you've written, I may be sort of repeating some themes that I've already brought up here, but you've been writing very favorably about this agreement in Survival, on the Survival blog. I mean, I think at one point a title, a headline, which authors never write the headlines, but in this case I think you did, is a surprisingly good deal. Now, the opposition, and I think you've correctly said in global opinion it's a minority view, but it's heavily concentrated in Israel and it's heavily concentrated in other Gulf, in Gulf Arab states, and it is, you know, sizably represented in the United States. Is that we are, you know, acceding to something that, let me put it this way, that, I mean, it's not stated this clearly, but it is essentially that military conflict over this problem is possibly inevitable, and we shouldn't shy away from it because the the alternative is going to be almost a nuclear-armed Iran. So I just wonder if you could, I mean, we've talked about this a lot and you've written about it a lot, but I wonder if you could say something about your view of that balance, of that calculation, that balance of calculations.
The calculation about a military...
Well, about greater confrontation, which many believe is going to lead to military action, versus a deal which is either, is either the one you say has barely a 10% chance of being reached, or one that would roll over this one for maybe another 3 or 4 years until circumstances could change.
Yeah. First of all, let me say that the opposition to the deal in Israel is not universal by any means, and it's not implacable, and it is nuanced. And one reason I wrote that headline of a surprisingly good deal is that I do pay a lot of attention to what they say in Israel, and I was reading all of the opposition to it when Netanyahu came out and even before the deal was done, criticized it in very, very harsh terms. But his entourage itself changed their talking points when they actually read the deal. And I had one diplomat who told me that, I have to be careful how I say this, but yeah, the nuance came in the day after the deal when they saw it. And you know, people like Amos Yadlin, a former military intelligence chief, now heading a research institute in Tel Aviv, he refers to Netanyahu's 4 no's. No enrichment, no centrifuges, no stockpile of enriched uranium, no Iraq. You know, these are the 4 no's that Netanyahu insists be in the final deal. And Amos Yadlin says 4 no's equals a 5th no. No deal. No deal. And a no deal does bring us down this path of military action, because no deal means Iran getting closer and closer, this breakout time getting shorter and shorter. And I don't think Iran has to overtly cross the line. If it gets too short, that will be enough for the intelligence analysts to tell the president they cannot guarantee that it would be detected in time. And if he gets that memo, then there'll be a very serious discussion in the White House, and the outcome of which I think still could be military action. That's the long and short of it.
Okay. Alex. And this will be the last question, unless there's anybody else who...
I mean, Mark,
Alex Niddle from the IIS.
Just talking about Tehran, what's happened in Tehran. I mean, you've said that Rouhani has not taken a strategic decision to abandon the program or anything like that. You've talked about the changes as being tactical. Nevertheless, something has happened. Obviously, there was a change of president, and there seems to have been some kind of change in attitude in Tehran. So I just wondered if you could just talk a little bit about the substance of that change. What is it exactly that has changed in Tehran that has allowed this amount of progress to be made?
Alex, thanks. There's a big debate in the analytical community about whether it was sanctions that brought Iran to the table, sanctions alone, sanctions mainly, or other factors. And opinion polling in Iran suggests that it was other factors. The people who say they voted for Rouhani because he would get sanctions lifted is, I don't know, about 11%. So there was something else. It was the prospect for change in other ways that Rouhani symbolized. And I don't know, some Iranians said they voted for him for tactical reasons. He wasn't their first choice, but he was the second best choice. Anyway, it's difficult for me, being in London, to ascribe what's going on in Iran. But sometimes you have a new president, a new leader, and he has enough of the confidence of the real leader, the supreme leader, to make a deal. Now, how far he can make a deal, I think, is the real question. He was able to make the tactical adjustments to get the interim deal off the ground. I don't know that even if he wanted to, whether he would be able to get the acquiescence of the supreme leader to make the kind of real limits, accept the real limits that would be required. And the supreme leader doesn't just rule on his own. He rules by consensus. There are various elites in Iran would have to be willing to go along with it, the Revolutionary Guard Corps and so forth, and I just don't see that happening. Could I answer one question that hasn't been asked that I meant to work in somehow?
Yes, you may.
Thank you. So I was at a parliamentary committee meeting the other day giving evidence, and a member of parliament who I greatly respect said something that I disagree with. And I heard him say it for the second time, so I want to say why I think Jack Straw is wrong about this. He was going on about Coca-Cola and how it is that, why is it that Coca-Cola you can buy Coca-Cola in Iran, and Coca-Cola in Atlanta can get the profits repatriated. But European countries can't, and when they try, the U.S. Treasury sanctions them to death. So I know I looked into this a bit, and I don't quite understand how Coca-Cola can actually get the profits. I don't know what bank they use, but it's not in violation of anything. It's not a violation to sell food products to Iran. And European companies do that. Nestle is one that sells its products in Iran, gets the profits back, is not sanctioned. So I think there was an exaggeration there. Thank you for asking that question.
Yeah, well, I'm glad I did. Okay, well, yeah, it was my pleasure. I'm glad I was able to ask it. But in addition, I think we all want to thank you for actually, we don't want to thank you because I have three things I'm supposed to say first. There is I just wanted to announce some future events. Tomorrow, at 1300 here in this room, Dr. Florence Gaub is going to talk about Libya, the failed fairy tale. On Tuesday the 11th, which I guess is a week from tomorrow, we have a meeting at 6 in the evening with Dr. Barnaba Benjamin, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of South Sudan. Where is South Sudan heading? So anyone interested in these events can email events@iiss.org. And I'm glad I remembered to do that because I almost was sure not to. In any event, Mark, your presentation has been, I wouldn't say greatly encouraging, but it has been hugely illuminating, and I'm sure everybody will join me in thanking you for it.